So when I use trunks on switches, remember the trunks are there to communicate and have the ability to accept multiple VLANs, uh, tagged traffic, and send them between switches. So what I want to do is I could always go in and configure my switch to um, to be in trunk mode, or my switch port to be in trunk mode. And as soon as that interface comes up, and I have and the switch actually sees the command to put the interface in trunk mode, that packet is sent to bring that interface up to trunk mode. The link is created. And as long as the other side is doing the very same thing in trunk mode, then we have a trunk link established. So I can send traffic, and now the difference where it would be different is if I had a trunk mode that was configured improperly and I had a VLAN mismatch between my trunks. So if I had let's say a connection with VLAN 30 allowed on one trunk link, and then I had a link to my other switch, and VLAN 20 was sitting here. Right? Let's say it was a typo. Right? If if all I had was these two VLANs configured on the trunk, then the data would not be able to flow. There would be an error. It would be trunk mismatch, right? VLAN mismatch. Because what I'm actually doing when I'm trunking is I'm sending a trunking packet between my switch so that I can configure that trunk interface. So that's an automatic um, active situation. But the default mode, right? And so again, we need a way to communicate between switches. So if my trunk link isn't established, I want to be able to establish it. So I have this idea of a switch port mode, and again, if I set the switch to access, it is never going to be. If I set the mode of the switch port to access, it is always going to be an access level port, and I want to do that because dynamic is the default. And as a matter of fact, dynamic auto is the default mode. So if I'm going to have a switch port in access mode, I want to set that specifically. If I'm going to use the best practice is if I'm going to use trunking on a particular port, I also go and set that specifically, switch port mode trunk. But what happens if I don't? Maybe I don't have access to both switches on both sides. That's kind of a rare situation, but it could be true that I don't have access to that, but I still want to bring a trunk mode up. So if my device is in a default mode of switch port mode dynamic auto, which is my default mode, it is in a listening state. It's waiting for something to happen, right? So I'm going to carry this line down here a little bit, I can see that this mode, dynamic auto, is a listening mode, okay? And so when I bring that trunk interface up, that that trunking mode is going to be initiated, and so what happens is that the trunk link is established automatically. But what if I want to create a mode where, in this case, it's not that both switches are automatically in a listening mode, where they're not generating any communication between the two for trunking, but we want to put them in a very active state, so where they automatically try to send um, dynamic trunking protocol packets between the switches to establish trunking. That's active. And one way I like to think about this is, what if it was sonar? Okay, and you think about sonar in a submarine or a ship, right? And there is an actual sound wave that is produced. It's not just, I'm not just listening for sound, right? In passive sonar, right, where I would have a microphone attached to a microphone array attached to something under the water, and I'm listening, right, for sound. Maybe it's for fish swimming around me, right? That's the passive mode. But when I use active mode in sonar, I actually create an audio impulse, and it goes out and it hits something and bounces back at me. That is an active sonar that I use, and we call it, in sonar speak, it's called a ping. So active sonar uses ping to create that audio pulse, and then it listens for the reflection. So dynamic desirable mode in trunking is like active sonar. Right? My switch is going to be set in the mode, and it is going to try and continuously communicate with whatever's on the other side of it to bring up a trunk link. Now, if my port on that other switch is set in one of these access or trunk modes, I'm basically in the ignore stage. I'm not going to respond to any links. If both of my switches are in trunk mode, they're gonna ignore each other in terms of any packets that are sent, but the trunk link is gonna be up because they're both in trunk mode. But it's in this mode that the dynamic auto is just, I'm just gonna listen. I'm just gonna wait for somebody to tell me what they want me to do. Right? If both of those switches are in that mode, that's when that port goes to access mode. When I turn one switch on the end of that connection to either a trunk or to dynamic desirable, that brings the trunk up. If I have both ends, that's like turning on active sonar, right, on both switches. And oh man, that's going to bring a trunk interface up quick, right? And so that's the idea. Is if I put that on dynamic desirable, what I'm really saying is I'm gonna trunk with anything I can trunk with. But if there happens to be a switch over there that is only in access mode only, I'm not gonna trunk, right? But if my switch is in dynamic auto mode, right? It's in listening mode, and this one is in active sonar mode. Okay, then we're gonna get that trunk link coming up. So this is just a way, and it's a way so that my switches can be very, very active in terms of bringing up a trunk link, because I may not be able to control both sides. And what I'm really thinking about is in a situation where I have my two switches here, and let's say that I have the ability to come in here and connect and communicate with this switch right here, and I cannot, for whatever reason, communicate over a link here. Maybe I'm not in the right VLAN to be able to access this switch, right? So if I were to set that port to dynamic desirable, that means that if this switch over here is in dynamic auto mode, right? If it was just a default, it's going to trunk, right? So that gives me a little more flexibility in how I can set up communications between the devices. But remember, best practice says if you have the ability in any way, go ahead and turn the trunk mode on specifically by using that command switchport mode trunk. Right? That would be your first priority, switchport mode trunk. The next one is if you know you want a trunk on the port, if you can't do switchport mode trunk, then you want to do switchport mode dynamic desirable. Right? And that's if there's ever any question about what's going to be over on that other side. If you know for sure that you're never going to trunk and you don't want to set it up, then you can turn it on to switchport mode access and specifically set it to an access port. But if you're not sure at all, that's what the default mode is, dynamic auto. All right, so this just allows you more control over your switch communication.